Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome everyone joining us on Zoom and welcome everybody joining us on Facebook Live as well to this Young Fabians event about the COVID-19 pandemic economic recovery and the Cooperative Party's excellent new report, Owning the Future, which places workers and communities at the heart of the recovery and how we can have a greater say and ownership in our economy. With me are Anna Birley.
Hi.
And Prowle.
Hello.
So they are two of our panelists tonight, and they are two of the co-authors of the report. We'll be having a discussion this evening to hear their reflections and also to hear any questions that you might have. So if you're joining on a Zoom webinar, there will be an option at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Please do write some questions in the chat and we'll get to them later on in the discussion once we've heard a bit more about the report. Just to mention as well, this will be put up on YouTube and there will be closed captions there for anyone who needs them. So just a quick word before we introduce our panelists. This event is hosted by the Young Fabians. I'm Mark, I'm part of their executive team. And the Young Fabians really is the under 31 branch of the Fabian Society, one of Britain's oldest think tanks and an affiliate and co-founder of the Labour Party. The Young Fabians are a democratic and decentralised organisation which is all about giving our members the opportunity to get involved in left-wing policy making and politics. So you can get involved with writing, podcasting, running events like this one, and in lots of different groups. So we've got 10 different policy networks, a BAME advocacy group, a brand new Young Fabians Scotland group, and 3 new regional groups covering the north of England, and more of those on the way as well. So we hope there'll be something for you to enjoy. So do head on over to, I'll just try and put a link in the chat now, the Young Fabians website for any further information and how to join. Okay, so on to the topic for tonight, which is very urgent and I hope very, very interesting. So Anna, would you like to introduce yourself first?
So I'm Anna. I am the policy officer for the Cooperative Party, and my role is to think about how we can change our economy into a much fairer one where wealth and power are shared, and how we build cooperative values and cooperative ways of working into every walk of life. So we talk about co-op schools, co-op housing, literally anything that is owned by its members and for the benefit of its members in the community. Caitlin and I met up on holiday in Wales not too many years ago and found some seaweed and asked our staff chat if we could start a seaweed co-op, and were promptly informed that there is already one actually. So my job is to talk about co-ops, think about how we can get more co-ops, but also create the kind of society that reflects our values, and to work with our MPs, and particularly those in the shadow cabinet. The Cooperative Party has lots of shadow ministers and secretaries of state, including Annalise Dodd. So this is a big topic of conversation we're doing to try and make sure that these values and principles and ideas sit in part of Labour's plan for recovery.
Fantastic, thanks Anna. And Caitlin?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Prowle. I've worked for the Co-op Party in a number of roles over the last sort of couple of years. Used to do some campaigning stuff back home in Wales and some local government stuff, but now I am loosely in charge of the Co-op Party's youth network. So we have a number of networks, one of which is the youth network. It has a committee, an elected committee with regional reps, and so my job is basically to be the go-between between that committee and our staff to work on the youth committee's goals and aims for the party, basically. So most recently that involved things like submitting to our party's policy process and doing a youth submission based on that, events, all of that good stuff. So that's my role within the party at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And for the uninitiated, would one of you mind giving a quick introduction to what the Co-op Party is and why, as a Labour activist and branch chair, I'm not going to get kicked out of the party by compliance for hosting this event here today?
We're a special case. There's not really an example to point to elsewhere on the relationship we have with the Labour Party, but essentially we are a full political party like anyone else, but we have had an electoral pact with the Labour Party since 1927. We were formed because we believed that, and has been borne out in practice too, that we have lots of values in common, that we are fighting for a very similar looking Britain, that our policy nuances made us stronger together, and that we would succeed better and create a better future for people in the country if we worked together and stood joint candidates. So we were started by the co-op movement. So a bit like sort of the Labour Party and the Fabians came from two different traditions. We're a third very radical tradition of the Labour movement that began its life on shop floors and factories where workers and customers organised themselves into cooperatives based on a set of shared values and principles, including things like care for the community and economic participation, democracy, and they use that to challenge the capitalist status quo and try and create something that was much fairer for communities in a way that meant that they were doing it for themselves. So rather than waiting for some top-down statist answers, the cooperative movement is very much about grassroots and bottom-up change. We've got a number of MPs. At our peak after 2017 election, we were proud to be the third largest party in Parliament. We're still punching above our weight. We have 26 MPs, about half the shadow cabinet are Cooperative Party MPs, including Annalise Dodds, Johnny Reynolds, Jim McMahon, Alex Sobel, it's sort of names I'm sure that you've seen on these events or that you're familiar with elsewhere. And our job, I guess, in our relationship is to contribute to Labour Party's policy, form part of the suite of answers as to how we create a fairer economy, work on behalf of the cooperative sector, who are trying their utmost to do business in a much fairer, more equitable, democratic way, but who keep finding themselves hitting barriers because the world was designed for shareholder-owned corporations, and it's a hard job being a co-op sometimes, and despite that they do all sorts of good things. So I guess that's who we are. We've got, as well as MPs, there are Lords, there are lots of councillors, a number of Metro mayors, so Andy Burnham, Dan Jarvis, and Newcastle, I'm going to get in so much trouble, Jamie in Newcastle, are all cooperative mayors. We have cooperative members of the Scottish Parliament, and they're not assembly members anymore, Caitlin, are they, in Wales?
No, members of the Welsh Parliament, yeah.
There we go, lots of members of the Welsh Parliament, and including the Welsh Cabinet. So yeah, we're well represented, but our sort of strength comes from our members in our movement, who are sort of usually the people you will find sort of out on the ground starting a community energy project or campaigning to get their local peer made an asset of community value.
Excellent work. There's so much there, and I know we're going to dig into a lot of these topics later on, but I wanted to set the scene first of all about the effect that COVID-19 has had and about the economy we need to build. I think, as you said, the Cooperative Party is very radical, and actually some of the most radical things in the 2019 Labour Manifesto and the 2017 Labour Manifesto came from the cooperative tradition. So some big ideas coming through in your report. Just to plug the Co-op Party report, Owning the Future has a lot of different sections. I believe a new chapter has just dropped today. And
yeah,
tomorrow. Sorry, I must have got the. Got an
no, they you'll. I think we'll have got something in your inbox today, possibly. But I was on holiday last week, so the chances of me getting something written in time for today's publication would be that's unkind.
Fair enough. Workers' rights and holidays are very important. So yeah, there's loads of chapters that form part of this really comprehensive report. I think the ones we'll focus on today are job retention and employee ownership, and also on in the age of the levelling up agenda, we're focusing on building place-based economies and what our answer is to this huge issue. But I know there are more chapters coming on a Green New Deal and public ownership, and fascinating topics, so do follow those as they come out. Just to set the scene then, why do we need to own the future? Like, what was wrong with Britain's economy before this pandemic hit?
So I guess we've got a massive problem of inequality, one that on the left of politics we feel a great moral responsibility to tackle, but equally with a sort of slightly wonkier economics hat on, we've got an economic responsibility to tackle inequality, because when you look through economies characterised by widening inequality, you often find that inequality gets wider and wider and wider preceding crash, and that economies reach crisis faster and grow more slowly when they experience greater inequality. So there's kind of an economic imperative if we're going to look at how we create that V-shaped recovery and make sure that we grow sustainably in a resilient way for longer without a sort of another crash coming. Inequality has to be the number one thing on our agenda. And what we also know, because we're cooperators, is that economies characterised by a bigger cooperative sector have much lower socio-economic inequality. So my favourite place, Emilia-Romagna, is a large province in Italy. It has one of the highest densities of co-ops anywhere in the world, and it also has the lowest socio-economic inequality anywhere in Europe. And you get similar in Mondragon in northern Spain, where their entire economy is based on cooperativism, where you see much smaller gaps between top paid and lowest paid, and much greater equality sort of pre-tax. It's a bit Miliband-esque or Elizabeth Warren-esque to talk about pre-distribution, but essentially we're saying that yes, we need to redistribute wealth, and that sort of welfare and tax discussion has to be part of our economic planning, but actually there are structural problems in our economy that we also need to fix. You need to redistribute a bit less, actually, if it's distributed more fairly in the first place, in the form of better wages, in the form of curbing excessive executive pay, in the form of redistributing profits to workers and communities instead of to distant shareholders. And then I guess the second half of that is that actually when we talk about shareholders, they're part of the problem. We've got an economic system where the rules are written to reward the kind of behaviour that creates greater inequality. The shareholder economy means that decisions are made much more short term. You've got a much narrower set of people who are less diverse making those decisions, and often in their own benefit in terms of short term gains, for example dividends, or lobbying for lower sort of corporate taxes, which damage our collective long-term gain. So both in terms of the environment and tackling climate change, and the long-term decision making that's going to be needed to bring about rapid response to that emergency, but also the long-term decisions which actually create more productivity, that create bigger profits, as it were, over a long term, but perhaps don't pay out next year, they pay out in 10 years time, and the system as is set up to disincentivize the kind of decision making that would create more long-termism and better productivity, which would then tackle inequality. And it's this circular problem that we try to describe in that sort of opening part of the report to sort of give you a context as to why we then think we should go and do some of these big policy changes as a result.
I think just to add to that really quickly as well is, I think when we talk about, like, inequality is very much a buzzword, right, in sort of policy making more broadly, but there's so many different types of inequality that sort of are going on in our current, if you just take the job sector alone, sort of what Anna was talking about in terms of inequality of income is a huge issue. There's also massive problems with regional inequality. I think one of the things that really drew me to the Co-op Party is this idea, many moons ago this was, this idea that it's about bringing power closer to people and closer to communities. And I think when you look at the massive regional imbalances that we have in terms of our economy, that is something that is so appealing about this idea of rebuilding a new economy, is that idea of actually distributing that wealth regionally as well as amongst different income groups. And then I also think, obviously I'm going to plug this given the introduction I've just given myself, but the sort of the inequalities that exist in terms of age as well. I was reading today that young workers have been almost disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and the economic shocks of that. And that's obviously because they are more likely to be in these insecure, low-paid sectors, and things like the gig economy and things like that as well. So I think there's so much when you say what's wrong with it, I guess there's so much wrong with it. It's so cheery, but what I mean by that is it's so multifaceted, and I think the inequality manifests itself in so many different ways, and so it's a very broad topic that we're tackling, I guess.
And sort of to avoid sounding too pessimistic, because I don't think the cooperative movement is by any means a pessimistic movement. We're doers. We're really lucky, because actually cooperation is a natural, a natural thing. My new favourite book, Whittaker Bregman on humankind, sort of goes into lots of examples that challenge our assumption that humans are sort of going to compete to the bitter end, and that we're all destined to look out for our personal self-interest. Actually, we're hugely cooperative, and I think through this crisis we've seen massive evidence of that, both in terms of the actions of the established organised cooperative societies. So supermarkets have gone above and beyond and been far more sort of responsive and responsible than perhaps some of their counterparts, but also your sort of community shops and community pubs. There's a lovely example in Brighton, the Bevy, a community pub, which has been repurposing itself to deliver meals to elderly customers. Or you've got community shops who are the only shop within walking distance for many older people who can't drive to the supermarket in town. Sort of community energy projects, pushing money and support into fuel poverty projects as people see their household incomes collapse, and then right through to your mutual aid group that sort of kicked off in the start of March and has bubbled up all of this sort of street by street cooperation that shows that actually we have a huge appetite to cooperate. Sometimes perhaps our response to crisis is to cooperate even more, and that gives us a window, but also a massive responsibility as socialists and as cooperators and as sort of people who care about our communities, to build on that now, and to institutionalize it so that we don't lose it in a sort of fit of cooperation and go back to normal, but that we create the institutions that support greater cooperation going forwards. It's a bit Ellen Ostrom of me, but if we create the rules that allow us to cooperate better, then we can create much faster and more exciting progress.
Absolutely. Really, really exciting examples you shared. Just turning to kind of job retention and how workers can own more of the economy as part of this. There's a big focus on, obviously, job-led recovery at the moment. The Conservatives and Labour are both chanting jobs, jobs, jobs. But while you also support job creation, obviously, you've also said that we can't just have any job at any cost. I just wanted to unpack what you meant by that and why we can't just charge for any jobs at any cost despite the desperation of the situation.
Yeah, well, I think sort of desperation and high unemployment in some contexts is where we see the worst excess of corporate exploitation of people who will do, if we look at garment workers is it Leicester, where they're sort of the only job they're able to get pays them well below the minimum wage, and desperation and the effects of austerity mean that they're prepared to do that. I don't think Labour believe that they want to have poor quality jobs that pay poverty wages. I think that might be what the Tories mean by their jobs, jobs, jobs chant, but I don't think Labour and the Cooperative Party are at all, we're in absolutely the same place, that it's about good jobs, it's about proper pay, it's about good working conditions, it's about the right to unionise in your workplace, it's about the right to be counted as an employee. And there was sort of news updates on the Uber drivers going to the Supreme Court today. So I don't think that there's even a piece of paper of difference between what we mean by jobs, jobs, jobs. I think what we would emphasise at the Cooperative Party and in this report is that a job's great, but actually if you are also an owner of the workplace in which you work, or you own a stake, it's even better. Not just because you're able to have a say over things like pay and a share in the profits of the business and the share of the fruits of your labour, to use a bit more of a sort of socialist language for exactly what a co-op does and means, but also that you're more likely to root those jobs in a place. So when we're looking at a long-term resilient recovery, what we don't want is to create jobs in a factory which goes overseas in 6 months' time. If workers own their own place, they're not going to vote to outsource their own jobs and livelihoods. And so you start to create much more resilient places. And as Caitlin was saying, that sort of regional aspect and devolving decision making and power, rather than just giving people a nice job from the top and letting them get on with their sort of Amazon warehouse. It's far more empowering and impactful on regional economies to have a bigger cooperative sector owned by its employees. Okay. I don't know, Caitlin, on the sort of gig economy and younger workers, there's definitely sort of discussion around jobs at any cost there too.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to what you said really quickly as well, which is I think that there's too much of a sort of status quo that goes on with this discussion in terms of alongside my wonderful job with the Co-op Party, I also work for an MP, and the MP represents an area where we're already, I mean, they already had a high level of unemployment, and we've already started to see what, you know, the next few years could look like in terms of widespread redundancies and whole, you know, sites closing down and things like that. And I think there's too much of a language and, like I say, a status quo of like, oh, okay, so there's job losses and that's it, there's nothing we can do about it, beyond maybe you know, sort of a consultation with employees to try and come to some sort of compromise that never really comes to anything, because those workers in those areas aren't empowered. So I think what I would really like to see, and I think this is particularly relevant for young workers, is a sort of retelling of that status quo and a sort of a better understanding of these alternatives. Like, I don't know, Anna's probably going to talk a little bit more about something like an employee buyout and things like that, which are options that may for the average person seem a bit pie in the sky, but actually they're really concrete, successful examples of that, where it's managed to transform a whole business and keep jobs. And so that's what I would like to see is sort of a raising awareness of that, and not basically allowing people to just accept their fate, if you know what I mean. And I guess in terms of the gig economy and, you know, any job's a job, I think Anna's absolutely right that history alone shows us that it's at times of like economic stress and shock that the worst sort of employer practices and things can come out. And I think as well as you know, looking into cooperative alternatives, that's where I'm really glad to have seen great campaigns. I think there was a great campaign somewhere in London between the TUC and one of the London councils about awareness raising of unions and joining a union and things like that. And I think that's going to be of increasing importance, particularly for young workers, but to be honest, across the board as well.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you raised the gig economy. I mean, as when I'm not doing Fabian stuff with my wonk hat on, I also volunteer with a local homeless charity. And this was before the pandemic. I went into homeless shelters and was talking to some of the people who stayed there as guests. And a lot of them were in work. And one of them showed me this app that several people at the shelter use, which you sort of swipe for a daily shift in the hospitality sector, and if you get a match, then you get a day's work or a week's work. And it struck me how bleak that was, especially seeing as some of the establishments that they were then working for on this super short-term gig basis really could afford to pay them better and give them a proper job. And it struck me that this was a bit like, you know, when my granddad went and worked in Liverpool docks and queued up for his day's work to see if he even had a day's work. Like the same dynamics are raising themselves again and again. It's in a time where things are very uncertain and people can get away with anything because times are just so desperate. So no, I'm really glad you've got that focus.
I think as well, though, I think that's exactly why this report is so timely and why I think it's so effective, is because there's sort of a crossroads, right? There's like, yes, we're in a time of such uncertainty and such stress for so many people, And so there's sort of almost one of two ways we can go. We can revert back to, you know, the economic recoveries that we've seen throughout history, as you said. I'm from South Wales. I know what a post-economic shock recovery looks like, you know. And so we can go down that avenue, or we can use this as an opportunity to say, oh, hang on a minute, why don't we wipe the slate clean a little bit and start again? And I think, not start again, but, you know, start to rewrite some of those rules. And I think that's why this report and the time that it's come at is so effective, which is me giving a lovely compliment to Anna.
I didn't pay Caitlin, I promise.
No, she didn't.
Excellent. Okay, so I suppose moving on to what we can do about the situation then. You clearly don't see any contradiction at all between workers owning businesses and job retention. There's not an either or of, you know, just going down the established route or trying something different. Employee ownership is the way to save jobs. So could you tell us a bit more about why that is and some of the recommendations you're making to try and make that happen? You mentioned Italy earlier. I'm fascinated by what you wrote about Italian law and how they've created a bigger cooperative sector.
Yeah, so Italy has this really cool, if you're a geek like me, really exciting law called the Marcora law. They've had it for a long time, and Italy's actually got cooperation written into their constitution. So, you know, they start from a much better point than we do, but we can learn really important lessons because the law gives workers the right and the means to own businesses that are at risk of shutting down. So in a place where perhaps there's a medium-sized employer shutting down a factory or a workshop or a whatever it is business where maybe all, or if not part if not all of the business is profitable or could be profitable, then this gives workers their future unemployment benefits up front in a lump sum and allows them to use that as capital to buy out the business with other support and access to cooperative loan funding. And what it means is that instead of unemployment isn't just miserable for a bit and then you get another job. Unemployment is, when it takes root, it's a very difficult thing to overcome. So you can end up with real long-term unemployment, and in a place where you've got a lot of people employed by the same organisation, you create pockets of unemployment that become self-perpetuating, and that inequality piece comes back to fore as well, and you create these regional pockets, and we saw that in the UK obviously. We see it now with the austerity agenda, where it hits some places much harder than others, and we saw it in the 80s, where unemployment became a very long-term situation for people. It cost the state a huge amount as well. So what they do in Italy is say, well, we're going to avoid all of the cost and heartbreak of creating these sort of long-term unemployment by letting you have that upfront, starting cooperatives, and it helps to save jobs and keep business operating in parts of the country where it might not otherwise. So I'm not saying it's necessarily the only answer. We obviously believe co-ops are the best answer, but as part of any suite of job retention work, it needs to look at how you keep jobs and prevent businesses from closing. And so I guess the other half of our thinking on that is that got coronavirus business interruption loans. There are tens of billions of pounds of government-backed loans that have been given to predominantly SMEs, but some larger companies and some micro traders as well. And there's actually last week, I think, some analysis out from the city, but a problem we've been thinking about a while is that most of those loans are toxic debt. They're not going to be able to be repaid. The parts of the economy hardest hit by lockdown, things like the hospitality sector, are also the parts of the economy that are going to grow most slowly because they have to reduce their take in order to meet social distancing guidelines. And so those loans, not only did they have to take out a big loan to start with, but they're also not going to make the income to be able to pay it back as quickly. And we're concerned about the risk that companies are going to shed staff in order to pay back loans, which actually becomes fairly self-defeating because all that has achieved is kept someone on furlough over the summer, and then they get fired, and so we haven't done our job in retaining jobs at all. So what we propose is that we would write off all or part of CBIL in order to providing the business transferred into employee ownership, all or part, and you sort of create a level of detail in how that's administered. But rather than losing staff, you empower staff and you write off a loan and create a business that's going to be more viable and remain open in the longer term.
I think one of the things I've always found really interesting about employee ownership as well is, and it's particularly relevant to the time that we're in, is that there's this huge thing now about, you know, we need to bounce back, we need to rebuild the economy. You know, the economy's been, you know, largely stopped to an extent and we need to get it back. And I think the one sort of gotcha that I've always found with employee ownership is that they are more productive businesses anyway. It's not a sort of, you're either this super economically successful and productive business or you empower your workers. They actually work hand in hand. And there's, you know, we don't need to tell you the stats on, you know, employee-owned businesses and cooperative businesses being successful, because that's all out there already. But I think when we're talking about an economic recovery and talking about a situation where we need to quote unquote bounce back, actually, if you're making that argument, then really employee ownership is a natural next step, because we know that they're successful businesses and we know that they will contribute to productivity and to just a healthier economic, you know, state, if you know what I mean. So I think that's a really interesting little stat to throw around, because I think it shows that there's real substance to this plan as well as all the massively successful examples that there are. There's also some real evidence to show that it not only does all this great stuff in empowering workers and giving, you know, workers more control over their lives and their work, it also has some massively helpful empirical evidence surrounding it as well.
There's some really interesting research in Germany and elsewhere that looks at the correlation between productivity and economic democracy, essentially. So both in terms of how many employer owners there are, as well as ESOPs, so where you own some shares, as well as sort of prevalent to things like credit unions and other forms of cooperative business and trade union rights. And actually, the better your workplace and the more of a stake you have in it, the more productive your economy is overall. And the more productive your economy is, that productivity pays for pay rises. So you can start to tackle inequality from both for the individuals who are going to benefit from owning their own business through that transition, that, you know, 40 people in such and such a factory in South Wales, but also the economy overall, if everywhere starts doing it, benefits everybody.
Excellent. I was really interested in looking into the Marcora law example. I mean, we may be talking about seizing the means of production for the workers here, but as you said, it just makes good empirical sense to be doing a lot of this work. When I looked up Marcora, it seemed that he was actually an industrialist who went and joined a centre-right political party, admittedly one with a slightly more enlightened tradition than the Thatcherite Tory party running the country at the time in the UK.
Not to go down too much of a rabbit warren of Italian cooperative history, but they're so good at co-ops partly because there is a cooperative tradition on both the left and the right. So it's only in the late 2000s and some things with Berlusconi that you started to see a government that was more antagonistic towards the cooperative sector. But they've got some incredible laws that we haven't talked about here, but that are really exciting to learn about if you're interested. So co-ops don't pay the same taxes as private businesses. Instead, they pay into a cooperative development fund, and because the cooperative sector is so big, they pay 3% into a cooperative development fund, which funds co-op growth and startups. So they have grown to the point where they're able to be quite self-sustaining, but equally the state recognises the value in that and doesn't tax them on other things. So there's no additional co-op tax, and it's an alternative co-op tax, so that they're able to help other co-ops, which is quite exciting.
Excellent. I did want to ask as well about self-employed workers. I think they've been so often forgotten during the economic response and recovery. It'd be remiss not to think about how we can strengthen the political voice of self-employed workers and the support packages available to them, and maybe help them if not join a cooperative, then cooperate with each other?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a number of different bits there to unpack. In terms of a voice, you know, we can see from things like the Federation of Small Businesses the importance that having a say and a voice and a platform for a sector is, in terms of making sure that it doesn't fall off of the political and policy making agenda. And I think it's sort of a shame that there isn't a sort of statutory role for a self-employed representative to be able to advocate for their sector, especially where the direction of travel that our economy is going in, and some of the maybe unintended, if I'm being kind, consequences of some of the economic decisions over the last decade have particularly affected self-employed workers. I'd like to think it was just an oversight, and that by having a self-employed champion at a senior level to be able to flag where there are going to be issues would make a big difference. And so I think we propose putting that in BAYS, and that it creates that voice in all policy, regulation, commissioning, and learning from the ways in which other sectors of the economy have done that successfully. And then I think then we need to have a look at the structures in which self-employed people work. So there's the kind of, you know, the rose-tinted version of self-employment is the freelance photographer who loves working from home and chooses it as a lifestyle choice, and there absolutely are lots of freelancers and self-employed people who are not suffering massively but are often forgotten, and who would benefit from cooperation, and some of them do already organise into co-ops. In Preston there's a psychologists co-op, for example. Music teachers in Swindon form a cooperative in order to manage the additional challenges that academisation presented to the way that they were working with schools. And then there's also the other end of the spectrum, which is your gig economy, your bike riders and taxi drivers, and the people who work for employment agencies, the people who maybe in the construction trade particularly can only get employed through agencies, so they might not be technically self-employed but they are in practice self-employed, don't have a lot of the employment rights. So I think there's, you know, and the unions do an excellent job in flagging these issues and taking people to court and making those shifts even though we're not in government. But actually there's also opportunity for cooperation to play a complementary role in strengthening their voice and rights in the workplace. I think that we shouldn't have we should have cooperative agencies where, like you have in acting, where the people working own the agency, where there's no exploitative middleman or woman, but also there's a role there in local government and in procurement around how we, you know, why should we be buying via agencies when we know that it erodes the working rights of people? So we've got some proposals that only cooperative and not-for-profit models of agencies can get public contracts, for example, because we know that that will be less exploitative, and we spend so much from the public purse that we can create a massive shift change in that. And then we also look at how you could own the platforms collectively, and we've already started seeing that. I'm going to let Caitlin talk about Drive because it's in Wales.
Yeah, I think I was just quickly going to come in, I'll come back to that, but on the gig economy stuff, there's some really interesting work being done where the Co-op Party Youth Network is probably going to do an event on this. Well, I'll keep some of it to myself, you know, but there's some really interesting stuff being done on terms of a cooperative equivalent to your Ubers and your Deliveroos and things like that. And I think it's exactly what you were saying, Mark, in terms of the people that you'd met at the homeless shelter who, because you are essentially working for yourself, and you're an individual, there's such an opportunity for exploitation there. And I think you've 100% started to see that in the big gig economy names. And so I think what the sort of co-op alternatives are looking to do, and there's some great examples. Taxis is the one that jumps out to me, and I can't remember exactly where it is.
Drive in Cardiff.
Oh, Drive in Cardiff. Oh no, I've moved to London for too long, guys.
The Welsh people are not going to forgive you, Caitlin.
No, that's terrible. No, there is Drive in Cardiff. I think there may be another example, maybe Manchester or Liverpool or something like that. But yeah, just really good examples of people, again, like looking at the status quo and thinking, actually, this doesn't really work for us. And so banding together and making it a collective rather than an individual. I think in the space of self-employment, I think that the last few months have shown us how much self-employed people have fallen through the cracks. Agency workers is a great example of it. In terms of the furlough scheme, there have been massive issues with agencies and who exactly is responsible for furlough. Is it the agency or the site that they're working at, and things like that. So I think it's really shown that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think banding together as a collective or a cooperative and using that collective voice, which is always going to be stronger, is a great place to start with it. And there are some really great examples, including Driving Cardiff.
Yeah, I think my final sort of couple of pieces around self-employment is that actually we do paint the horror stories. It is a good route to work for lots of people, and that it, organised in the right way and with the proper support, then self-employment can be a great option. But that as a job seeker, you're penalised for seeking self-employment rather than seeking employment. You go to a job centre and you're required under the sort of strict regime around universal credit and others to find a job. And if you enter self-employment at that difficult beginning stage where you're a person who probably doesn't have a lot of capital, and that is why you're at a job centre, you lose your benefits for trying to start gainful self-employment. So we look at the formation of employment cooperatives for people who wish to take a step into the world of self-employment but who don't have the means to be able to bear all of the risk straight away, so that they're able to be a member of an employment cooperative without losing out on their job seeker benefits while they start out. So I think there's hopefully something quite exciting there, and sort of drawing from ideas of bread funds from way back when, and sort of interesting ways of mutual support that we've seen happen in parts of the country now and historically.
Excellent. There's so many good ideas there. I did want to pick up on Drive, because I think that's a great example of building around a place, building a new economic settlement in a particular place. Of course, there's a huge agenda at the moment about levelling up the country, but some very worrying findings today about the way that the government actually allocated that money out to towns in advance of the 2019 election. So much needs to be reformed about the way we do local government funding. You've got some radical ideas about scrapping council tax and business rates. I do want to leave time for the Q&A, and I know somebody on the call might be interested in asking a question, so I'll put a pin in that for now. But I did want to ask about regional inequality more generally. You proposed some wealth building, community wealth building approaches. Could you tell us a bit more about community wealth building and how that would work, and how we can fit that into the recovery?
So I'm sure, I think it's quite the topic of, it's the, I don't know, whatever the word is. Anyway, it's become a popular concept over the last few years. It's the brainchild in part from the US and work that was happening in Cleveland, in Rust Belt, Ohio, to look at a place in a different way. So rather than simply seeing problems, they also saw wealth, but that wasn't accessed by the majority of people. So I guess it comes back to that inequality piece. You had some of the wealthiest medical institutions in Cleveland living cheap by jowl with some of the poorest communities in America, and they decided that actually there's a cooperative solution. So they looked at what they call anchor institutions, which are organisations which are never going to leave a place, looked at their spend, looked at how much of that spend was leaving the place, and they found, unsurprisingly, and I'm sure that anyone who's ever had anything to do with public procurement or local government knows that the choice of businesses you have to buy from, if you're going to outsource something, generally aren't the place that you're from. They might employ your local residents, but it's on a minimum wage job, or a living wage job if you're a living wage council like Lambeth, where I'm a councillor. But you know that it isn't creating local wealth, and actually spending money locally creates a multiplier effect. And we talked a lot about the benefits of worker ownership and anchoring jobs in a place, and the benefits that worker ownership has. So in Cleveland, they used the combined procurement spend of a number of anchor institutions and identified that in laundry, energy and food, there was enough collective spend to create large cooperative companies owned by their workers, where, you know, if you were working in a laundry before, you were probably washing the same sheets as you are now, but the difference being that you're also a co-owner of the organisation that you work for, that you have a say in the way the decisions are made, that you have an opportunity to sit on the board, and that you get a share in the profits of your labour rather than just being paid the lowest wage they can get away with. So that came over to the UK. Actually, councils for a long time have been looking at sort of buying local and how they can make better use of their procurement spend. But what was really exciting about the work that Matthew Brown led in Preston was also tying that in with a wider community wealth building narrative, telling a better story, bringing people with him, and looking at that cooperative vision and looking at it through a lens of ownership as well as a lens of local spend. And so that's sort of where it's at. You take local anchor institution spend, you look at other options for patient capital, so pension funds, for example, and use them to create worker-owned businesses that take on local contracts. And I guess rather than waiting for Whitehall to have a change of heart and fund local government properly, it's a way of, at least in the interim, doing more with what we've got.
Excellent. And I'm very refreshed and impressed by the fact you didn't say Preston model at any point in that discussion, because it is a great model, but I think we've heard so much about it.
It's a fabulous model, and everywhere seems to have a model these days. You know, a lot of credit does have to go to Matthew Brown. He really pioneered the approach and worked very hard to engage with the thinkers and policymakers in Cleveland, and has really championed it. So I don't want to take the glory away from Preston in any sense, but equally border models.
Excellent. Do you have anything to add on community wealth building, Caitlin?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about it recently as a real, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about sort of taking this opportunity to change the way we think about our entire economy. And I think that starts at a local level, and should always start at the local level. And I think it's a, you know, as horrifying as these widespread redundancies that we're starting to see are, I think it does present us with an opportunity to think, okay, well, what do we replace those with? And I think looking back throughout history, like certainly in South Wales and elsewhere, when coal mines closed, the biggest problem with that was that it wasn't replaced with anything. There was no sort of targeted investment or real effort to build local jobs, and that's why, you know, those sorts of areas, I'm from there so I can say it, have really struggled since, and I think what we want to avoid is a repeat of that across the whole UK. So I think what community wealth building does is it takes a completely different approach to it, and rather than saying, you know, what, you know, massive global companies can we get to base themselves here and give jobs to people here, it's about actually taking a completely different approach and saying, actually, what have we got here that we can use and that we can build from? And so it really goes back to what I was saying earlier about using this moment as an opportunity, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, just with a note, because I don't want to get in trouble with, well, because I'm a councillor, I don't want to get in trouble with all the other councillors and co-op councillors, but community wealth building is great, and it is producing really exciting results, and it is creating a much more decentralised economy, which is something we want, but it isn't a replacement for an end to austerity, and we also need to be funding councils properly. Yes, just a caveat.
Yeah, I think one of the things that certainly, like, the wider Co-op Party policy always emphasises, and this report as well, is that there are massive structural changes in terms of legislation that needs to be made to make any of this happen. And I think there's a massive issue in the UK in terms of the environment that cooperatives have to operate in, certainly compared to other countries. Like Anna was mentioning Italy as one great example of it. There's a sort of fundamental structure that needs to be in place before we can put this stuff in place. So yeah, it's definitely worth remembering that, I think.
Absolutely. And I did want to ask, as my final question before we take hopefully a few questions from the audience, I guess I just wanted to know your ideas about how we can help community wealth builders then through legislation, as policymakers, I'm not a policymaker myself, but how can progressive politicians and activists help to get more powers for co-ops, and what role can community wealth builders and local co-ops play in preventing this nightmare scenario where COVID leads to the acceleration of the shuttering of our shops and high streets and local services?
So I guess there's kind of the depressing half of it is that we're not in government, and so we have a role, and maybe many of you joining us today are in parts of the country who don't have the joys of a Labour and Co-op MP, or even just a Labour MP, better than all the alternatives. And so lobbying for the Tories to take on board any of the things that we talk about, I think, is important. There are some open doors. Conservative Party MPs often represent areas with credit unions and community shops, and so maybe that's the thin end of the wedge, and we can start to really champion some of these things by getting those MPs on board, for example. I think that we have a responsibility in politics and on the left, not just to talk about what we believe in and hope for a better, sunnier day, but to be cooperators on the ground and to take matters into our own hands, not in any revolutionary way, other than it's quite a radical thing to do, to say I'm going to put my time into shaking up my local economy. There's this really nice example that I've got in the chapter on place in Dumfries, where they are buying out empty shops and repurposing them into productive, community-owned and cooperative enterprises. They're doing it in collaboration with some of their councillors, and it's sort of, and they were actually doing that pre-coronavirus, and I think there are lessons for us in terms of what actions we can do as members of our own communities to create a fairer local economy. Even if, many of us on this call probably, that a political party needs policy. I'm going to be much better off than the majority of people in the UK, many of whom will experience long periods of unemployment, because we're going to see massive recession in parts of the country that are sort of already bearing the scars of deindustrialisation and the last recession. And so we have a responsibility, and I think this opportunity that Kate, but also that we started the call with, where people are getting to know their neighbours and they are embracing cooperative action on the ground. Actually, we all have a job to be involved in those communities, to engage with our local councillors, to stand for local council. You can stand as a Labour and Co-op councillor too, to start co-op and to begin community energy projects because you believe renewable energy is going to save the world from climate crisis, to do something about your high street. And I think that's sort of part of the radical tradition that the Cooperative Party perhaps brings to the Labour Party, to come full circle back to where we began, is that we're a movement of doers, people who got on with starting a shop despite the fact that the odds were set against them. And I think that the way that we build community wealth is by getting on with it, not waiting for permission, not sort of worrying about obviously worrying about who's in charge in Westminster. That's hugely important, and the last Labour government saw great support for the cooperative movement, and every manifesto we've had since has had sort of increasingly historic commitments to growing the sector, and we absolutely need a Labour and cooperative government. But in the meantime, we have a responsibility to do the best we absolutely can for our neighbours and communities, and that's where I think there is an opportunity for cooperators to organise and create change in their own places.
Great. And were there any reflections on that from you, Caitlin, before we
I think I really like the idea of taking all the good stuff that we've seen from the last few months forward, and like Anna said earlier, like institutionalizing it. I think that's the key part. But the Youth Co-op Party Youth Network recently did a call with our members about the policy platform, one part of which is about connecting communities. And because of the context that it took place in, it wasn't originally planned to be about COVID or anything, but we heard both on the call and sort of following, we heard from a lot of young members who were talking about the various ways that connecting communities has manifested itself in their individual lives and their contexts and things. And one of the things we got chatting about was like things like the digital divide, generationally, but also in terms of income groups and things like that. And there had been some really lovely examples of groups of young people banding together in their community and helping older people with some of their tech issues, whether that was, you know, wanting to FaceTime their grandchildren or be involved in things like this, you know, online churches, online community groups and things like that. And one of the things that I was thinking was, wouldn't it be nice if we actually took that forward and made these more you know, commonplace initiatives. You know, it's a lovely idea to have the sort of digital native generation sharing those skills in a way that's distributed and things like that. So I think the idea of taking things that we've learned over the last few months and taking them forward out of this, I really hope in a way that we don't lose a lot of the cooperative spirit that's come out of the last few months. I hope that isn't lost, because I think it's shown many of our communities in a really good light. And so, yeah, I hope we can take that forward.
And I think the other part of that I'd add is that actually I think that's how we win back power. We win by demonstrating our values in practice and by people seeing the difference that Labour and Cooperative can make on the ground, and use that proper community involvement and bottom-up change to show that if we're lent a vote, we can do even more with all of the tools that government has at its beck and call, but also by building those relationships and creating a much more bottom-up politics where people feel like they've got a stake and it's worth being involved and that they can understand what values mean.
Absolutely. Fantastic. I feel very inspired by that, and I hope that we can, at a very dark time, keep some of that cooperative spirit as well. I mean, like you said, it's been amazing to see the mutual aid groups spring up and things to, at least for a while, become more community oriented. Great. I don't see any questions yet in the chat. I was having a quick look. Please do, everybody. I think we'll be wrapping up in about 5 or 10 minutes time, unless there's any questions. So please do put them in, and I can either read them out for you, or I can allow you to talk as well. Just feel free to specify which. Some nice feedback in the chat, but no questions yet. Thanks, Amadea. I guess I had one, I got one fairly tricky, maybe one, just to fill in the time.
One for Anna, I reckon.
Yeah. So it's more out of, a lot of it's out of personal interest, but at the 2019 election, we went in with a manifesto which included some really radical things, and almost the most radical thing, I think, was inclusive ownership funds, where essentially when companies issue shares, the government would say that some of them have to go to workers, and I think the government keeps some of the value as well to help refund public services. Do you see inclusive ownership funds as part of the policy platform going forward in the economic recovery or in our campaigning in the Labour and Cooperative movements?
It's not actually Co-op Party policy. That was one where the Labour Party went, yes, no, that one didn't come from us. I think that, you know, we do want to see workers owning a stake in their business, and we work very closely with the Employee Ownership Association and a number of employee-owned businesses. and we think that it should be easier to transition into employee ownership. We think that there should be incentives to do so, like we talked about in here, but coercion isn't a hugely cooperative tradition. So equally, you know, we don't necessarily believe that we should appropriate businesses ad hoc, I guess, if that makes sense. That there are ways of creating an economy characterised by employee ownership and by co-ops, which doesn't perhaps cause so many problems. I'll see if I can dig out if you circulate afterwards information. I did a really interesting interview for the Financial Times shortly after she became the Shadow Chancellor, which looked at this, and it's very much continues a commitment to growing the cooperative sector. We had doubling the sector in both of the last two manifestos, which is radical. It's a you know, that I'd say cooperativism is a huge challenge to capitalism as we know it, without being sort of a state-led thing that people fear as well. Wouldn't say the things that we put in there weren't radical, but I think that there's some nuance about how we go about it, I guess, that her article deals with really well.
Excellent. And I suppose, unless there's any more, my final question was then about how you do mobilise that private finance, because quite a big radical idea would be mobilising much more patient capital into levelling up, into a Green New Deal, into getting affordable housing built. And it would be a huge, huge success if we could lobby our way to a place where that became a success. Would you mind talking through a couple of your ideas in the report there about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a few times in my life where I get to talk about pensions outside of, I'm chair of my pensions committee, and everyone rolls my eyes about that being a potentially boring job, but actually it's really exciting because you know, when we talk about investors, it's not tarring everybody with one big bad bash. Actually, there are some really good long-term patients who help create sustainable growth and who apply values in the way they do so. And so local government has done a lot to lead the way around creating patient capital for value creation rather than sort of extractive, and to tackle the climate crisis. So Lambeth, where I'm a councillor, we're the first borough to have fully sort of our plan and delivered decarbonisation in our pension investments, and we are creating, along with other London councils as part of the sort of collective body that London pension pots work together on, a kind of place-based investment fund. So it invests within our local communities and in startups, in affordable housing and that kind of thing. So there is definitely work that can be done then. Preston, Manchester have done some really exciting things too. Not to steal their thunder, I think Manchester have done some really cool place-based investment using sort of patient capital from their pension fund. But one big challenge around the way that companies normally raise is often through people buying shares or becoming investors. And as a cooperative, our ownership, we're own members, and that could be tens of thousands of people, and so it doesn't really equate with our structures, values or principles to have some venture capitalists come along and pump loads of cash in exchange for a huge bit of control because we're one member, one vote. That doesn't suit the traditional finance world. It's not to say there aren't people who don't want to put money into co-ops, but that the structures we've got set up don't suit that. So we were looking at a law in Australia, part of their treasury laws, the really boring long bits, but this one's quite exciting because it creates non-withdrawable share capital. So you're able to be an investor in a co-op without all of the challenges essentially that come with co-op ownership structures, because it's a piece of legislation designed in order to meet the needs of co-op sector specifically, and it enables new investment to be found from sort of the investor sector. I also just think that if we have collectively a set of values we want to put into principle, we put our money where our mouth is, and there are very few other policy areas that are required to justify self-financing. If we want to reduce inequality, we should be investing in cooperatives and creating an economy with more co-ops in, and therefore we should be spending money on that, just like if we want a new railway we have to spend money on the track and sleepers. So think there's a role for state funding. I think that the state would more than it in terms of improved productivity, tax return and better employment quality. We'd be tackling things like poverty pay by improving the quality of jobs and ownership and inequality. So I think it pays itself back, but it's not necessarily a direct one. But I think that we should be funding through grants and loans the co-op sector to grow at an exponential rate if we're going to recover fairly at all.
Excellent. Again, huge ideas. Please, everybody, do read the reports as the last chapters come out, and I'm particularly excited to see the one on the Green New Deal, which, of course, has been huge on the political agenda, and we need to make sure that it continues to be in the future as well, especially as COP is being pushed back a year. We need that to be really, really ambitious and radical, and hopefully it can have some ideas about cooperatives in there as well.
If you're just to butt in, if you're interested in that, plug time. If you're interested in that, the obviously our Co-op Party conference is going to be online this year in October, and the all of the details of that you'll be able to find on our website. But the Youth Network's fringe event, which will be a Zoom, one of these type scenarios, is going to be on climate change in the context of the co-op movement, and what sort of cooperative groups and cooperative values even more broadly are doing already to tackle that. So that'll be a really exciting session, so tune in for that in several months' time. I wish it was next week now, so I could be like, see you next week. But yeah, that'll be a really good session, I think.
Amazing, and hopefully we can have lots of young Fabians there, although I know yeah, a lot of us don't meet the standards of youth that the Co-op Party perhaps. But yeah, I hope that we can have lots of people attend that because it sounds awesome. Well, thanks both very much for joining. Did you have any last reflections or anything else you wanted to plug before we wrap up the call?
The next chapter launches tomorrow. It is a plan for an alternative financial services sector. So we look at how we democratise the way our money is looked after and spent, and how we, again, decentralise. We're hugely centralised in the way that our 4 banks monopolise our financial services sector, both for retail and for SME lending. So you can join me again tomorrow lunchtime. Our weekly Wednesday lunchtime Zoom. We've got 3 different credit unions from across the country joining us, as well as the body that represents the credit union sector. And we'll be talking about both what we hope the role for mutual forms of finance are in the future, as well as the impact that COVID has had on the credit unions and the way that they're already disrupting the financial sector under your own noses, even if you don't know your local credit union. So do join that, or if you can't make it, join your credit union instead. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to speak to new people. Thanks for having us, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much. And to everybody, thank you very much for joining. If you're not already a member of the Young Fabians and you like what you heard tonight, please do head over to youngfabian.org.uk just for the latest updates about our events, our blogs, our podcasts, and how to join as well if you are really interested and you're aged under 31. If you're over 31, please join the Fabian Society because they also do amazing stuff. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Caitlin. Have a good evening.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.